Barbara County Planning Commission. Would you please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mr. Villalobos, could you give us the TV coverage announcement, please?
Planning Commission hearings are televised live on County Santa Barbara Television, CSB TV, Channel 20 at 9 a.m. in the South Coast, Lompoc, Santa Ynez Valley, Santa Maria, and Orchid areas. Rebroadcast of the Planning Commission hearings are on Fridays at 5 p.m. on CSB TV, Channel 20. And now for the roll call. Commissioner Brooks?
Here.
Commissioner Cooney?
Here.
Commissioner Blau?
Here.
Commissioner Valencia?
Here.
For the record, Commissioner Brown is absent.
Thank you, and we hope that she's back with us next week. And now the projection report, Ms. Easter.
Yes, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. This morning you have a consent item on your agenda as well as 3 items that were intended to be heard today. We are proposing that item number 2 be dropped from your agenda. It simply wasn't quite ready for your review, and we will renotice and re-agendize that when we're ready to bring that to the commission.
All right.
In terms of the projection report, we won't be meeting again for a couple of weeks until March 3rd. Next week is the Montecito Planning Commission, so we'll meet in 2 weeks on March 3rd in Santa Barbara. If you'll turn to your projection report, the first item on the projection report is the Terrace Ranch General Plan Amendment that was continued by your commission, and we believe that that item will actually be heard in April rather than in March due to some additional work that needs to be done. So we expect that to change to April 14th. We will be coming back with the Icon Mixed Use project that you heard last week, as well as the Estero Park improvement and then the Stormwater Management program briefing. We are proposing to cancel both March 10th and March 17th, and we'll look for you to do that by motion on March 3rd. So your next meeting will be April 7th, assuming that we obtain some items for that date. I expect we will, but there's nothing on your projection report yet. And then April 14th will be another hearing in Santa Maria in this hearing room, and we have a couple of items on that day already. And I think that's all I really need to review.
Fine. Any questions? All right, I see none. At this time, we'll go to the public comment area. If you have any items that are not on today's agenda, please step up to the microphone and tell us what you have on your mind. Seeing no one rise, we'll go on to the Planning Commissioner's informational reports. Does anybody have anything they'd like to report? Slow day today. All right, and we'll go to the minutes then of February 3rd. What's the wish of the council, commission?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Commissioner Blau.
I'll second.
Thank you, Commissioner Brooks. Any questions or items, changes, deletions? Seeing none, would you please call the roll?
Okay, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Brooks?
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney?
Aye.
Commissioner Blau?
Aye.
Commissioner Valencia?
Aye.
Motion carries 4-0.
All right, at this time, we'll have the Director's Report and Board of Supervisors hearing summary. Dr. Russell?
Good morning, Commissioners. I don't really have too much to report since our last meeting and workshop a week ago. There was a single board hearing yesterday, and the item of interest, which was the extension of the marijuana dispensary moratorium, required a 4/5 vote, and there were only 3 supervisors present, so that was continued until next week. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you. Any questions? None? All right, with that, we'll go on to the consent agenda item. And would you please read that into the record?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The following is the hearing on the request of the Office of Long Range Planning to receive and review the 2007-2009 Comprehensive General Plan Annual Progress Report and to direct staff to forward any comments to the Board of Supervisors.
All right.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to point out that we do have a revision memo to this item. And so if the commission is not going to open it for a public hearing, I just want you to incorporate that revision memo into your motion.
All right.
And then you may want to ask whether or not there are any public speakers on this, or if any
All
commissioners
right. I'll
wish
ask,
to
thank you.
pull it off the consent.
All right. We'll ask the commission first. Do they have any questions concerning this item, the Comprehensive General Plan Progress Report? Commissioner Cooney.
Mr. Chair, I just, while I realize this is an annual task of the Planning Commission, and this year, the report is as thorough and complete and without question as it usually is, that it is still a benefit to the public to understand exactly what we are approving. So I would like to take it off the consent agenda for just a brief presentation by appropriate staff of what the report is, and we can approve it and move on with our regular agenda.
All right. Thank you. Any other comments? And do we have somebody from the staff to give us that?
Yes, Mr. Eady's here,
All right.
Mr. Chair, and will present.
Thank you, Chair and Commissioner Cooney. If you give us just a few moments, we'll go ahead and open up a PowerPoint presentation we prepared in case the Commission had questions.
While you're preparing, there's a matrix on page 17 that probably should be passed out to everybody, made available, because it helps understand the project. Thank you.
Thank you for your patience, Chairman and fellow Commissioners. Good morning. My name is Nathan Eady. I work for the Office of Long Range Planning. As just a brief overview of the Long Range Planning's efforts to provide an annual progress report. This report is prepared to comply with Government Code 65400. Its primary purpose is to both update the Planning Commission and the Board of Supervisors of recent actions that long-range planning and other planning development staff have taken to maintain our general plan on an ongoing basis. It also provides some report on our progress in meeting our regional housing needs and the housing production data that we produce on an annual basis. This report is then forwarded on to the state for their review. I believe they use it primarily for statistical purposes to provide an idea of how housing issues are being dealt with statewide. The report summarizes some of the major accomplishments that the county has pursued in the ongoing maintenance of its general plan, a portion of which also consists of our community plans. And as the Commission is aware, some of our recent accomplishments have been the adoption of the Santa Ynez Valley Community Plan. We also adopted the 2003-2008 housing element in February of last year. We've also recently updated our agricultural preserve uniform rules. And one of the most notable projects is an electronic conversion of the Comprehensive General Plan, which has really allowed that document to be far more publicly accessible, being posted online now and word searchable. It's really much more of a usable document now. As far as ongoing projects, the Office of Long Range Planning is currently working on a Goleta Community Plan update, a Gaviota Coast Plan. Obviously, we're in the midst of updating our housing element for the 2009 and 14 planning period, and we are also providing quite a substantial update to the Los Alamos Community Plan. The report also includes some record of the housing activity over the past 3 years. Most notably, we have permitted 538 homes in that 3-year period. A statistic of particular interest is that 60% of those homes which were permitted in 2009 were deemed affordable. And this is mainly not due to the county's inclusionary housing or state density bonus program, but just that the market has fallen so greatly in the last 3 years that even market rate homes in the the Santa Maria and Lompoc Valley areas are affordable without any need for deed restriction. As far as special needs housing, the county has also permitted 42 residential second units, 56 mobile homes, and 11 farm employee dwellings in that time. And it's, as far as it relates to this annual report, we count those housing units as the actual building permit is issued, not the land use or discretionary permit. And that's the presentation we have, but I'd be more than happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? I don't see any lights. Thank you very much. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Eady.
Ms. Black, what is the action that we need to take now following this?
Mr. Chair, we would need a motion that you receive and reviewed the Comprehensive Plan Annual Progress Report and forward a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors to receive and file. And if you could incorporate the February 12th memo to the Planning Commission into that motion, that would
All
be.
right, thank you very much.
So moved.
Thank you, Commissioner Blau. Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
Thank you, Commissioner Brooks. Any further comments? Seeing none, Ms. Rodriguez, would you call the roll?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Brooks?
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney?
Aye.
Commissioner Blau?
Aye.
Commissioner Valencia?
Aye.
Motion passes 4-0.
All right, and now we'll move on to our standard agenda. Do we need a little time to set up for that? No? All right, we'll get ready, and Ms. Rodriguez, could you read item number 1 into the record, please?
No, this is one we're going to hear.
The following is the hearing on the request of Sid Goldstein, agent for Kevin Gleason, owner, to consider case number 09RMM2, application filed on June 24th, 2009, and to approve the addendum to negative declaration 02ND22 pursuant to the state guidelines for implementation of CEQA.
All right, thank you. Any site visits or any, yes, Commissioner Brooks.
Yes, I did do a site visit with Mr. Goldstein and Mr. Lewis on February 4th.
Commissioner Cooney.
Yes, I had the good fortune to be able to visit this beautiful property as well. I met Mr. Goldstein and also Mr. Gleason was present, and it was a pleasure to meet them all and understand by looking at the land what they propose.
Thanks. And I also had a site visit with Mr. Goldstein and his associate and drove around the property a little bit. So, and with that, Ms. Gerber?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. Maybe we could turn the lights down. Thank you. This case is a request to modify tentative parcel map 14527, the Refugio Ranches 2A lot split, which was approved in 2003. Just to give you a brief recap before we start, the proposed modification would first add 2.3 acres to the non-habitable portion of the development envelope. And second, it would remove the 100-foot residential setback from 20% slopes, which would require modifying condition 6 of the map. The subject lot is an approximately 414-acre parcel. It's zoned Ag 200, and it's outlined here in the bottom of this slide in blue. It's kind of hard to see. The bottom is kind of jaggedy there. You can see that the parcel is located along and south of the San Ynez River, and it's east of South Refugio Road and south of Highway 246. Thanks, David. So here's the parcel. Here's the river. Refugio Road comes down this way, and 246 comes across, and here's the airport. It's located at 3790 Via Rancheros Road. This is just another view showing the parcel and the surroundings parcels. It's under an agricultural preserve contract, It contains a 989 square foot ag equipment storage building, vineyards, and irrigated alfalfa with some grazing use, and it's accessed from Refugio Road like this, right across. The parcel boundaries are outlined in pink on this USGS topo quad map. You can see again the river valley to the north and the slopes that rise from it to the south. Only one area of the parcel, as you can see here, is really suitable for development, and that's right there. During processing of the map that created the parcel, a geological study was conducted because the whole area is underlain with unstable soils that result from landslides. The study was conducted before specific locations had been developed or identified for possible development. Based on the results, a structural setback of 100 feet from the toe of the amphitheater slope, which is also the 725-foot contour line here, was identified for all structural development. In conformance with this recommendation, a 16.44 acre development envelope was approved, and it's shown here with the 725-foot contour and again the 100-foot setback. Here's a close-up of the development envelope, again showing the 725-foot contour and the 100-foot setback. Most of this envelope was identified as safe for non-habitable buildings but unsuitable for habitable structures because of the unstable soils. Only the northern portion was deemed safe for residential development. However, an additional restriction was placed on the parcel, on the development envelope, that all residential development be located at least 100 feet from slopes over 20%. Again, because of possible unstable soils. So the hatched portion here of the development envelope is the non-habitable area. The black shows slopes of over 20%, and the lined area around that shows the 100-foot setback, which leaves the habitable development envelope shown there in the white. So that is pretty restrictive of where you can put a residence. The owner is now requesting to add to this area, outlined in pink, to the non-habitable portion of the development envelope. The original development envelope was placed somewhat arbitrarily, and total development would still be restricted to 2 acres within the larger development envelope because of the Ag Preserve contract, so there's no reason from a planning perspective to prohibit this addition. Also, after the map recorded, specific areas were identified for residential development. However, both of these areas were closer than 100 feet to slopes over 20%. So as recommended by the county geologist at that time, additional geological testing was performed at these locations, shown here as locations B1 and B2, which are located right there. The results indicated that with application of standard building and grading code requirements, these areas are suitable from a geologic standpoint for residential development, and that the 100-foot setback from 20% slopes is unnecessary. This assessment was confirmed by an independent geological review conducted by a county-selected geologist. As a result, the applicant is requesting that condition number 6 be modified to remove the 100-foot residential setback from 20% slopes. This map shows the proposed revised map resulting from first adding the 2.3 acres to the non-habitable part of the 16.44 acre development envelope, and second, removing the 100-foot residential setback from 20% or greater slopes. These requests comply with all zoning and comprehensive plan requirements, including visual resource policies, ag element goals, and the seismic safety and safety elements. The original map was environmentally reviewed under negative declaration 2 ND 22, and an addendum to the ND was prepared for the current project under CEQA guidelines section 15164, which allows for an addendum to be prepared when only minor technical changes or changes that do not create new significant impacts would result. At the time the staff report was docketed, County Council requested changes to the findings and conditions, which are shown in the memorandum to your commission dated February 12th. Specifically, the language in CEQA Finding 1 was slightly revised, and CEQA Finding 4 was removed as redundant. Also, previously, it was not clear what conditions applied to the recorded map modification as opposed to the original TPM, so they were separated out. In conclusion, staff recommends that your commission make the required findings for the project, accept the CEQA Section 15164 addendum to O2 ND 22, and approve the project subject to the conditions. The owner and agent are here, and I would also be happy to answer any questions that you have.
All right, thank you, Ms. Gerber. Any questions? Don't appear to have any questions at this time. Would they like to make a statement of any sort, or?
Good morning, Commissioner Valencia, members of the commission. My name is Robert Ruiz, and I'm from Sid Goldstein's office. We represent the owners for this property. Mrs. Gerber's staff report was pretty thorough. I had some items I wanted to go through, but I think she covered them all. I just want to echo that the request will not eliminate the 100-foot setback from the ancient known slide areas. The request is to eliminate the 100-foot setback from 20% slopes for areas that we did have site-specific slope stability studies prepared, and there was no hazard or technical reason why those setbacks should be in place. So our request is to remove those. Also, the area we would like to include in the non-habitable portion of the envelope is relatively flat. It's free of trees, and it's out of a public view shed, and it will allow the applicant to take advantage of it and use it because of its proximity to the existing ag storage building. With that said, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Commissioner Cooney has a question.
Mr. Ruiz, where is the existing ag storage building in relation to the request to add to the non-habitable portion of the development envelope?
Yeah, it is in this area over here.
So it's in the portion that was originally approved for development?
That's correct. Yes, that's correct.
Okay. That was my only question. Thank you.
Any other questions? Don't see any. Thank you very much, Mr. Reese.
Thank you.
All right, at this time, we'll open the public hearing. Is there anybody here who would like to speak on this subject? Do we have any? We have none. We'll bring it back to the staff. Does the staff have any further comment? No? All right, we'll bring it back to the commission. This is a third district item. Commissioner Brooks, how would you like to proceed on this?
Yes, thank you. I don't see any issues. No one has brought any new information up. I'm ready to make a motion.
All right.
If
Fine.
that is,
And let's see if there are any other comments. Any other comments by the commissioners? None? All right, at this time, Commissioner Cooney.
I just wanted to add, Mr. Chair, it was particularly helpful in this instance, as it often is, to be able to visit the site, see the slope that raised the original concern, and also the small hill that has slopes in excess of 20%. It might be concerning, given the original findings, but the subsequent geotechnical report seems clear that there isn't a hazard. So I think the commission can fully support this request.
All right, thank you very much for your comments. And with that, Commissioner Brooks, we're ready for your motion.
okay. Thank you, Chair Valencia, today. I would like to make a motion then that we make the required findings as specified in Attachment A and as revised by the memorandum dated February 12th, 2010, that we accept the addendum as for CEQA guidelines, and that this is adequate environmental review has been given, and we approve the project subject to the conditions in C and as revised in the Planning Commission memorandum dated February 12th, 2010.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I will second. Mr.
Thank you,
Chair.
Commissioner Cooney. Any further discussion? All right, Ms. Rodriguez, would you call the roll?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Brooks?
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney?
Aye.
Commissioner Blau?
Aye.
Commissioner Valencia?
Aye.
Motion carries 4-0.
All right, thank you. And with that, we have a second item that we need to take, do we need a moment to drop that?
Yeah, I'll
Mr.
make a
Chair.
motion to be dropped off the agenda.
Ms. Mueller, did you have,
Mr. Chair, we have to read that item into the record. and then
all
we can-
right,
We can do that.
all right. Ms. Rodriguez, could you read item number 2 into the record, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The following is the hearing on the request of Camille Asuri, Goleta Sanitary District, to consider the following. A09 RVP1 application filed on January 29, 2009. B09 CDP application filed on December 7, 2009. And to adopt the mitigation measures in the mitigated negative declaration SCH number 20080611141, prepared by the Goleta Sanitary District pursuant to the state guidelines for implementation of SEQA.
All right, thank you. And before we take a motion, were there any site visits or ex parte? Hearing none. Any public comment on this item? No? All right. And with that, this is a second district item, but the second district commissioner, the chair, is not here today. So can we have a motion?
All right,
Commissioner Blau?
Yeah, I'll move that we drop it from the agenda.
All right, second.
I'll second.
Thank you,
Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Cooney. Ms. Rodriguez, would you please call the roll?
Commissioner Brooks?
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney?
Aye.
Commissioner Blau?
Aye.
Commissioner Valencia?
Aye.
Motion carries 4-0.
All right, thank you. And now, Ms. Meester, could you give us some guidance on item number 3?
Mr. Chair, if we could just take about a 5 or 10-minute break to set up, then we'll
All
be
right.
ready to proceed.
At this time, we'll take a 5-minute break. Ordinance amendments. Ms. Rodriguez, would you please read that into the record?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The following is the hearing on the request of the Planning and Development Department that the County Planning Commission consider and adopt recommendation to the Board of Supervisors they adopt an ordinance case number 09 ORD9, amending the county's land use and development code to streamline the permit process for certain agriculture projects and land zoned agriculture.
Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez. And was there any ex parte, I don't think there's any site visits on this, but any ex parte of any sort on this? Seeing none? Oh, yes, Commissioner Cooney.
I did have a meeting with Ms. Christina McGinnis of the Open Project regarding these amendments last week, I believe.
All right, thank you. All right, and with that, go straight to,
Yes.
oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Brooke, Commissioner Brooks.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Valencia. I had also a meeting with Ms. McGinnis, and then I did speak yesterday to Ms. Saley, and I know that in her presentation today, she is already ready to answer some of the questions that I had then.
All right, thank you. Anything? Staff?
Mr. Chair, I think Ms. Saley will be giving the staff presentation. Mr. Langle and I are both here and will assist in answering any of your questions.
All right. Thank you. And with that, Ms. Saley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. Good morning. It was just about a year ago, the last time we had a discussion about this. The Ag Advisory Committee members were involved, and we've done a lot of things in the last year we'd like to talk about today. In terms of the presentation, I'd like to give you a little bit of background about how we got here, why we're working on agricultural issues, some about agriculture in Santa Barbara County. This county is considered in the top 1% of agricultural counties in the country. We've had a lot of public input and various advisory committee input. We'd like to talk about that briefly. And then there are 5 basic amendments. We propose that we talk about them one at a time. In other words, I'll present the background issues and what we're recommending, and then stop and see if the commission has any questions, just trying to keep the confusion level to a minimum, because there are 5 issues and they're related, but they're all different as well. Talk about environmental review, we had a negative declaration. Talk about in the course of that, talk about the public input we've received, and then we've received as well as any public input that we may have. Today, we have received probably 7 or 8 letters that have been forwarded to you. And finally, Planning Commission discussion, and if you're comfortable, action. So that is our proposal for the presentation in the next hour or so. First, just a bit of background. Almost 5 years ago now, the process improvement effort that covers a lot of different areas related to development review, this was discussed by the board, and recommendation was made that they initiate a process, and there were 5 priority areas, one of which was agricultural permitting and process. So we have been working on that intermittently over the last 5 years, and specifically what the board asked us to do was streamline the process for typical agricultural activities and projects. So that has been our focus. Just a bit about agriculture. There's just over 1.5 million acres in Santa Barbara County, and about half of that is in private ownership, the National Forest in Vandenberg making up a lot of the public ownership. And a good percentage of that, 80–85%, is zoned for agriculture, not all of which we're talking about today, but we're really focusing on the Ag 2 areas more so than Ag 1. But a lot of this county is zoned for agriculture, so these proposed amendments do affect a lot of land, and that's been some of our challenge here, is trying to figure out what the results might be. The value of ag as of 2007 was well over $1 billion, so it's very important to our local economy. This is the project area map. It shows the 5 districts. It also shows the Ag 1 zone, which is the lighter green, and the Ag 2 zone, which, as you can see, is the preponderance of ag zoning throughout the county, and especially in the western half of the county. The production areas, these are the areas that we have looked at. Santa Maria has the greatest percentage, but throughout the county we have a lot of agriculture. Strawberries right now are the leading crop by almost a factor of 3 over the next highest, which is broccoli, but you can see all the various types of crops that are grown here. One of the important issues as we've looked at these proposed ordinance amendments is agricultural preserves, and we know that you've heard a lot about these over the years just in the various projects and programs you've reviewed. But the basic premise of it's the Williamson Act coming down from the state level is that in exchange for placing land under contract for a minimum of 10 years, it rolls, it continues to renew. But in exchange for that, the property owner gets tax benefits. The property is taxed at a lower level, so it's a mutually beneficial arrangement. And of the Ag 2 zoned lands, which is the primary thing we're talking about today, over 1,900 of close to 2,200 parcels are zoned Ag 2 and in agricultural preserves. And then any development on an ag preserve or a property under contract must go through the Agricultural Preserve Advisory Committee. It's reviewed by agricultural staff. They're also here, Stephanie Stark and Michael Hayes, if we have questions for them. So there are limitations. It's, as I said, a mutually beneficial thing, but while ag preserve contracts can be non-renewed, when that happens, it's 10 years before the contract expires, and on very rare occasions, contracts are actually canceled, but the rules for that are very stringent. So this is definitely a consideration when we're looking at these proposed ordinances, that many of these parcels have these restrictions and they would remain. Here's some data on the Ag 1 and Ag 2 zoned lots in the county. And the categories along the left correspond to the proposed groupings, if you will, for the changes to the development plan thresholds. You can see that there are close to 2,500 Ag 1 lots that are under 40 acres, and we're really not proposing much in the way of change to those. And a small percentage, roughly 10%, are in ag preserves. The smaller Ag 2 lots, 1,158, about a quarter are in ag preserves. But as the lots get bigger, a much higher percentage are in ag preserves. It's just easier for them to operate that way. Before we get into this, just want to recap the public process. As I said, this really began almost 5 years ago when the board endorsed us looking at ways to simplify ag permitting and processing. We did a workshop about a year later with your commission, and that was very informative, got some early input. The next couple of years, we worked primarily with the Ag Advisory Committee. We worked with the Oversight Committee somewhat and returned to your commission in a joint workshop with the AAC about a year ago. And in this intervening year, we released a draft negative declaration in May. Got a lot of comments on that. We did a pretty major revision. I'll talk about those in a minute. And in December, released a revised negative declaration and received some letters on that, and we'll talk about those as well. The first amendment that we're proposing relates to agricultural accessory structures. This would typically be like hay barn or a horse barn or storage, something of that nature. We are recommending that only in the Ag 2 zone, instead of requiring a land use permit, a zoning clearance would be required. And I think you recall that the submittal requirements and staff review of both a land use permit and a zoning clearance are the same. However, a zoning clearance does not have public notice, and there is no possibility of appeal. That's the one difference. It's important to note that an ag accessory building of up to 3,000 square feet, which is what we're talking about here, does not require a building permit, yet it requires a land use permit. So that's one of the reasons we settled on a maximum of 3,000 square feet. There would have to be a demonstration that the use is truly accessory to agriculture. Limited utilities, hose, bib, just some lighting, that sort of thing, not a full-on bathroom with a shower. That's not what we're envisioning. And then to address visual concerns, we're suggesting that if one of these structures were to be proposed within 1,000 feet of a road, so 1,000 feet either side or 2,000 feet total, a land use permit would still be required to address any visual concerns unless it can be demonstrated that the structure would not be visible if there's a hill or something and it's behind that. And the comments we received on the negative declaration related to visual issues, somewhat to ag and biological resource issues too. So at this point, I think the way we agreed, if you have any questions on this issue in particular, before I move on to the other ones, this would be a good time to ask them. Thank you.
Ms. Saley, there were some letters, and I think they would take time to answer, especially the one from the San Lucas Ranch with respect to these items that you're bringing up. So I would rather hold my questions to the end so that maybe you could address those all at once.
Okay.
Are there any other questions by members of the Commission? If not, please proceed.
Thank you. The second amendment relates to gate posts, cross members, and ramps. And the upper picture is sort of a typical gate post. This was the kind of thing we were trying to develop standards or findings that would need to be made, that small scale gates like this with a sign hanging under the cross member, the kind of thing that if an applicant met these standards we're proposing, which includes no lighting, maximum height of 18 feet, that's to accommodate a semi truck coming through, and not hitting the sign. The gate posts would need to be a maximum of 2 feet in any direction, like the footprint of those, so roughly 4 square feet. The cross member, a maximum of 2 feet high and 6 inches thick. We were looking for something fairly modest, not a huge stone cross member or something of that nature. And then the bottom picture is sort of a typical loading ramp, and this is something the Ag Advisory Committee asked for, that these are under typical situations located near gates. A large truck would be there, the animals are, led up the ramp right onto the truck, and we've developed specifications. We're saying a maximum of 10 feet in height, excluding the rails. There were some questions this week about that, and 42 inches wide. So though all those parameters can be met, no permit would be required. This would be an exclusion in lieu of a land use permit. And we really didn't receive any issues on the negative declaration related to this. We have had some questions this last week. Are these appropriate parameters? And I'm sure we'll hear some testimony about that. So are there any specific questions about that before I move on?
I have one point, and I can't seem to work this. Oh, hey, here it is. If somebody wants to put a very fancy entrance here on this side, they can still do it, but they can't go under this process. Is that correct? There are some very fancy ones on Cat Canyon area and all the Santa Ynez Valley, that are just very pretty. They go about this big, in the entrance. So they could still do it, but they wouldn't be eligible for this part. Is that correct?
I'm going to let Mr. Langle, he's much more up on this.
I don't want to hold this up much, just run through it real quick.
Mr. Chair and members of the commission, currently fences and gate posts of less than 8 feet and fences of less than 6 feet are considered to be exempt from permit requirements. So provided your fancy ranch entry met those particular standards, it could go in as an exemption. Anything above those would normally require a land use permit. What we were trying to address with this was the request from the agriculturalists that they be allowed to have a taller type of a structure to allow for large trucks being able to pass through and have a cross member as well that would aid in their agriculture operation without having to go through the land use permit process. So that's what this is really trying to address is the increased height of the gate post and then allowing the cross member to occur.
Commissioner Brooks has a question.
Yes, thank you. I had raised a question, and I don't know if this is an appropriate time, but there was some concerns about shared access roads. Will you be addressing this later in the presentation, or should this be added to the list at this point? There are some issues with shared access, and if this would not go under review, that might pose problems for neighbors, if they didn't know what perhaps the main owner would be proposing for that.
Commissioner Brooks, members of the commission, that's typically a civil matter between the property owners. If you have an easement over somebody else's property, then there are the county really doesn't get involved in trying to mediate conflicts between the different holders of the easement and the actual property owner. So if somebody wanted to come in and say, I want to put a gate like this on my property, we're not going to look any further as to whoever might also be using that for an easement to their own property.
Okay, my concern there then would be, public review, if there's no possibility for appeal. If the neighbor doesn't know what's coming, how would this be addressed?
Well, I'm not sure what the neighbor's concern might be, I guess is my question. Because they would still have to be able to use it for access to their own property, even though it's located on under another person's actual ownership. So for example, if I had an easement through that gate to access my property, my neighboring property to the west, for example, the owner, the person who erected the gate, would still have to respect my rights under that easement and allow me to utilize it.
Okay, talk about it more maybe at a later time.
Thank you. Please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The third area is farm employee dwellings, and currently these are allowed in Ag 1 and Ag 2 zones with a minor conditional use permit, which is heard by the zoning administrator. Obviously, public notice and appeal. We are proposing to shift the approval path for these dwellings from a minor CUP to a land use permit. Still requires public notice and ability to appeal, but there's not a hearing per se. And we feel this is appropriate in the interest of providing housing on site for employees. The requirements that we're proposing are in the Ag 1 zones, the employee would need to work on site full-time, and in the Ag 2, we said a majority of the time, and that came out of our workshop a year ago, the AAC members saying that there is some sharing of employees, and on larger Ag 2 parcels, it's more appropriate, they felt, and the commission at that time agreed to allow them to work a majority, technically 51% of the time on site, and they may be able to work elsewhere. The current requirement for documentation, excuse me, notice to property owner, that sort of thing would still pertain, and then we are proposing a new finding to address comments received on the ND relating to siting to minimize impacts to agriculture. We felt that was appropriate. In terms of negative declaration issues, excuse me, visual issues were raised, ag, I just mentioned, bio issues, and then we also got an email about enforcement concern that people might be living in these that don't actually work there. And we do have some proposals to strengthen the sort of notification and documentation process that we feel will help to address these issues. So any questions on this before I move on?
Sail right through that one.
The fourth area is detached residential second units, or RSUs. They're currently only allowed in the Ag 1, 5, 10, and 20 acre zones. And the AAC and a couple people who wrote letters were interested in expanding this to the Ag 2 zones. Our mandate from the board is just to look at existing processes, so that's why we're focusing on this here. At some future date, there might be a move to expand these to the Ag 2, but not right now. Similar to the farm employee dwellings, these now require a minor conditional use permit heard by the zoning administrator, proposing to switch it to a land use permit. The height and size limits would remain, those would not change. We are proposing to revise one of the standards, one of the findings, you might say. We have new language that we feel would better protect existing on-site agriculture. And we tried to use that same language throughout. Wherever we're having a finding or a development standard, we're using the same language. The issues raised related to visual, where they might be sited, ag, in terms of how it might impact ag. That's why we're proposing to change the finding or the standard, and then somewhat biological issues. So this is basically a shift from zoning administrator hearing to a land use permit. Any questions here?
Commissioner Cooney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Saley, so under this proposal, a particular parcel could have in the Ag 1, 5, 10, and 20 zoning areas could have both a detached residential second unit and a farm employee dwelling if it otherwise qualified?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
And I have one question. Kind of curious about the 1,200 square feet. Some of these families that are working out there are career families that have been on these ranches for years and years. And there's 3 and 4 kids in these families, and 1,200 square feet seems a little tight. What caused you to go to 1,200 rather than, say, like a 1,400 square feet where they'd have a little bit more room to be able to participate?
Mr. Chairman, first of all, that is an existing requirement, and we're not proposing to change it. And I believe it comes from state law, but Mr. Langle, I think, could elaborate.
Mr. Chair and members of the commission, yes, as Ms. Saley just mentioned, the main purpose of this particular amendment was not to change the different development standards, but just to change the permit requirement to reduce it from a minor conditional use permit to a land use permit. So it'd be a faster, easier, cheaper process. The standards regarding height, floor area, et cetera, were arrived at several years ago through a series of very intense hearings in front of both the Montecito Planning Commission and your Planning Commission. There was a lot of public input involved in that, and we just didn't think it was appropriate as part of this exercise to go back in, reopen those standards one more time.
All right, thank you. And there's still always the option by the rancher or farmer, whatever, to come in and appeal or try to increase this by 150 feet or square feet or whatever. That still is, but that it would not fit under the land use permit then.
Mr. Chair, in order to do that, because these are development standards, more or less black and white criteria in the development code, they would actually have to apply for and have approved a variance to allow for an
Oh,
increase
all
in the
right.
floor area.
Thank you for answering that, and let's continue on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The fifth and probably most important and most involved recommendation relates to changing the development plan threshold in Ag 2 zones only. Currently, countywide, the threshold for cumulative square feet, all the buildings regardless of uses, excuse me, is 20,000 square feet. So you could have a quarter-acre lot in the foothills of Goleta or 10,000-acre Ag 2 zoned parcel. They have the same threshold. And the Ag Advisory Committee was particularly interested in raising that threshold because there are just various ancillary primary, secondary buildings that they need to operate, and going through, once they trigger the threshold, they go over 20,000 square feet. Coming to the Planning Commission for a development plan is a lengthy and expensive process and inhibits their ability to operate. We had earlier, as I'm sure you'll hear from some testimony, recommended 100,000 square feet for the largest lots, and with a graduated scale coming down. And we, in the comments we received on the first negative declaration that we released in May, there was a lot of concern about cumulatively what would 100,000 square feet mean under reasonable assumptions countywide when you look at the number of parcels and acreage. And we did a lot of work looking at what is typical ag. If it's cattle ranching, what are their typical buildings? If it's row crops. We looked at the last 10 years worth of development plan applications where they triggered the 20,000 square feet. And we came to realize that 100,000, there really aren't a lot of parcels out there that have that amount of development, but there were a lot that were just below 50, and it really made sense. And we recognize other people feel that number should be bigger. We certainly look forward to the discussion with the commission about this. We also got a lot of feedback in terms of, well, if you raise the threshold, people could buy some of these parcels and put very large houses on them. And we realized that wasn't our intention. We're trying to make ag more viable. And so we said a way to address that is to introduce a new threshold of 10,000 square feet for non-agricultural buildings. So that would be primary residence, a garage for their vehicles, pool houses, that sort of thing, 10,000 square feet. And we did receive probably more comments on that in the letters than anything else. like to hear your comments on it as well. The single building maximum of 20,000 square feet, we're proposing, that is basically now if you have a vacant lot, you could put one large 20,000 square foot building on it. So we felt that was appropriate. And in comments on the negative declaration, a lot about visual, ag viability, and biological issues. So those three issues came up most frequently. Couple more slides before we take questions. Here are the proposed thresholds. Again, the current threshold is 20,000 square feet. Only parcels of 40 acres or greater would have a larger threshold, and the increments go up pretty slowly. 320 acres or more would have 50,000 square feet, 2.5 times the current threshold, and there are 504 lots of that are in that category. Many of them are quite large. And then just before we take questions on this, just want to remind the commission and the public, there is no change proposed to the review process for these types of applications, and these tend to be the ones that raise a lot of issues. We really, of the 5 types of permits we're discussing, the only ones that have had appeals really are 2 development plans, and they tend to be sort of neighborhood access, kind of what we were talking about a moment ago, the shared access thing. There aren't a lot of appeals, but these kinds of projects that often raise a lot of interest and controversy in the communities, there is no change to those. We're really just talking about the size of buildings and trying to make agricultural operations a bit more viable. So with that, be happy to answer any questions on this.
All right, thank you. Any questions concerning the document or what is proposed? If not, I would rather let the public speak, and then we could get back into what things that we like and deliberate the issues, rather than challenge anything now at this time. Yes, Commissioner Brooks.
Yes, I did have a question on the 5th one, on the thresholds. There was some, in my sense, ambiguity with the language. Is it ag and non-ag? You know, how is that broken down for the threshold?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Brooks, it doesn't matter what the use is. It's the cumulative square footage.
All right. All right, and with that, thank you for the staff report. Any further comments, Ms. Black? No? All right, with that, we'll open the public hearing, and anybody who wishes to speak on this subject. We normally allow 3 minutes, but in some cases, I realize that this involves very controversial things that have been being worked on for year and year and year, so I think we can go for 4 minutes if anybody needs 4 minutes. We ask you to be clear and succinct in what you have to say so that we understand. Oh, these are in order? All right, and our first speaker would be, oh, these are the bottom, okay. That's it, all right, thank you.
Mr. Chair, I don't know if you intended for Ms. Saley to finish her presentation. She actually didn't finish her
Oh, she
presentation.
didn't?
No.
Oh, I'm
She
sorry, I
just
thought-
finished that 5th issue, and then I think there are a few more slides to
Oh,
go
all
over
right.
for environmental
Thank you.
review,
Yes,
so.
please continue, Ms.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be brief. Environmental review, I already ran through sort of some of the history, released a negative declaration in May, got pretty significant comments, did a lot of reevaluation, talked to the Oversight Committee, Ag Advisory Committee. There wasn't unanimity, that is clear. We released a revised negative declaration in December and received about 5 or 6 letters. Those were transmitted to you. Made some revisions. And just for the record, I think it's important to understand what those revisions were between May and now. And just briefly, the ag issue, land use permit, if within 1,000 feet either side of a public road or area to address visual issue, we think that's a pretty simple way of addressing that, but effective. We also removed Ag 1 zones from consideration for various things, the ag accessory buildings, the gates, and changes to the development plan threshold. We added ag compatibility findings. We think that makes it better. And I just described a moment ago the changes to the DP threshold. And then we did have a sixth item before, which was allowing single-family homes up to 3,500 square feet. And that just proved to be too problematic to deal with through development standards. And we thought, if it's that problematic, let's just drop it. On aesthetics, the kind of issues we heard from people are, basic ones. Visibility from public streets, trails, parks, that sort of thing. And you might remember we had really nice looking graphics before. We showed the contours. We were trying to identify particularly scenic roads, and it got too complicated, and that's where we went to for ag accessory buildings, the 1,000 feet. There are design overlays, especially now with the San Ynez Community Plan. 154 and portions of 1 are scenic highways. They require BAR review. I already mentioned the ag accessory buildings. The development standards for gates and ramps, we think, will ensure that they'll be modest in scale and appearance. And then the general findings of comprehensive plan consistency. There are conservation element policies, land use element policies. The community plans have a lot of design review policies, so we feel pretty comfortable that as we've proposed it, these issues will not be significant. That said, just full disclosure, one of the public comments we got requested additional development standards about night lighting, finding about consistency with rural character, minimizing infrastructure height, and not allowing alteration of ridgeline and public view sheds. We didn't feel we needed to go that far, but if it's your recommendation to the board, and if you do feel it's appropriate to include those, we recommend that these kind of development standards be included. And it would not be that difficult to add them to the ordinance, proposed ordinance. Agricultural resources, I mentioned the challenges we had trying to figure out what is a typical agricultural operation. I think we managed to do that pretty well. Just general comments about ag viability and detached residential second units. Would they displace prime ag soils, things like that. There are quite a few considerations. The ag preserve limitations, where the vast majority of Ag 2 parcels are in ag preserves. There's various easements, conservation, development rights. The findings that we have revised that we feel for detached RSUs in farm employee housing will definitely help. And then just generally the comprehensive plan policies that support agriculture. Biological resources, just concern about location, environmentally sensitive habitats. We felt the various policies in the comp plan, the ag element, the conservation element, and hillside and watershed policies, federal, state law. We thought there was a lot of coverage there. Again, full disclosure, one of the public comments proposed additional development plan standards, so would only apply there. That there be no development within 100 feet from an environmentally sensitive habitat area. And on the right-hand side of the screen are the types of habitats that we would suggest be included if you wanted to include this in the ordinance. We got comments, as I mentioned earlier, development plan, the threshold's too high, threshold's too low. Concern about the non-agricultural threshold that we're proposing of 10,000 square feet. Cumulative impacts, some wanted us to quantify, which we felt was just way too speculative. We couldn't do that. Enforcement of employee housing was mentioned, and we are proposing to tighten that up. And then these are, today we're looking for input from the commission, the public, if the commission is comfortable after their discussion, taking action, and then we would see that this item going to the board probably in April. And the amendments would be in effect 1 month later. So that concludes the presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And with that, We'll go to the public, open the public hearing. Our first speaker is Cynthia Durner.
Can I request a change? I'm Fred Durner, her husband, and she would like to follow me. Is that
All right, that would be fine.
is this the appropriate place?
Mr. Valencia and Planning Commission, thank you for your service to the community. We really appreciate your input and direction. And Mr. Langle and the Planning Department, thank you for all your professional services. We have a ranch that approaches or is in the 40 to 100 acre size. It's in Goleta. It may not quite be typical of an agricultural operation with regard to being what was referred to as being typical. We do two things on our ranch. We grow avocados, and then we do horse boarding. It's not a riding stable as such. It is a boarding stable where many families, instead of putting their horse in their backyard or on their small parcel, choose to put it on our ranch where professional services are provided to take care of their horses. So it really is a very, very positive input to the community as far as families and providing an atmosphere in the country with their horse. My main concern in doing avocados and horses is the fact that we need to have square footage increased from the proposed 25,000 to a lot more than that, maybe even up to 35,000 or greater than that, because we find that even to shelter a horse, either in a corral or in a pasture or in a barn, the square footage is quite extensive per horse. And I think you had a copy of this distributed to you that shows various shade and rain structures that we consider a cover. And during rainy seasons, for instance, we feed horses under those covers so that the feed stays dry. We also think that it's very important to take care of our equipment for the avocados in barns and equipment sheds. There's a lot of structures related to both operations on our ranch that we feel need to be included and not included in the development plan threshold. These shade structures, the shade covers for the horses, probably shouldn't be included in the threshold accumulation of square footage. There have been concerns with regard to visual and biological considerations. I think these can be mitigated with proper landscaping, colors, and so forth. So a lot of ranches and big parcels are away from homes, away from highways, and can be mitigated to location as well. So thank you very much for your time, and appreciate your consideration of raising that from a 25 proposed to greater than 35,000 for the 40 to 100 acre parcels.
Thank you very much for your comments. Cynthia?
Hi, I'm Cynthia Durner. I just wanted to approach this from our family. I'm a mother and a grandmother, and we have our ranch is run by our family. So we really, to continue this on, doing it properly, as my husband pointed out, we need to have that threshold raised to at least 35,000 square feet. We enjoy running the ranch as a family, and I think it's very beneficial. And as he said, there's families who enjoy our ranch. They come there with their children, and it's a very positive activity for them. Thank you.
35, thank you very much. Grant Creams?
Good morning. My name is Grant Kramers. I'm the president of Central Coast Wine Growers and chair of the AAC, the Agricultural Advisory Committee. I'm here today actually speaking on behalf of myself, a resident of Santa Barbara County that makes his living in production agriculture. I'm pleased with the process here. I think anytime we can look at our own regulations and say, hey, we can improve this, and when the improvement is streamlining something, I think we're all going in the right direction. There's been a lot of effort through the AAC, and that's how things should run. The AAC is a bunch of agriculturists that are very busy, but are more than happy to take the time to give input and comment so that the county and agriculture can both flourish together. Do I think that this draft in front of us is the final solution? I don't think so, but I think it's got a tremendous amount of good information in it. I would like to read, as a statement of fact from the AAC meetings, a couple blurbs from the minutes, so you can get a feeling of the comments that were held at that were stated at the meeting. November 4th, 2009. This is a direct quote from the minutes of the meeting. The development plan threshold, 10,000 square feet is too small for a realistic ag building and suggests threshold remains at 20,000 square feet. Low development plan thresholds discourage clustering of structures and encourages buildings on adjacent parcels instead. Suggested of 75,000 or 100,000 square feet for max threshold instead of 50,000 square feet. A non-ag development cap is an option they would prefer over drastically reducing the development plan thresholds. The committee thought retaining the development plan threshold of 20,000 square feet for Ag 1 parcels was acceptable. And then from the February 3rd, 2010 meeting, which are unapproved minutes at this point, the Ag Advisory members commented, livestock loading ramp requirements are too small, security lights are sometimes necessary on electric gates, and multiple parcels can be operated as one ranch. Limits on non-ag development are not an issue to the AAC. So those are a couple statements from the AAC, just out of their minutes there. Personally, a couple other comments. As far as the employee housing goes, it gets tricky as far as limiting the amount of time they're working on parcels or sites. I think that needs to be carefully worded because a lot of these businesses, the housing may be on one parcel, but the business owns multiple parcels and the employee could be working on any given one of those parcels. And then another important thing specifically, in my opinion, is the lights at night. Ag operations run 24 hours a day. Equipment comes in and out at night, produce comes in and out at night, and you get to these gates and there's structures that we need, have the name, have the address, have some integrity of the fencing structure and so forth, but the trucks need to be able to see them also. It's a security issue and a safety issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andrew Druner? Okay, well, is he remote? Yes, there he is.
Yes.
Go
Thank
ahead.
you for granting us the time to speak this morning.
We can't hear you. Just a moment. Can
you hear me now?
All right. Get close to the mic.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you for granting us the time to speak this morning. We are here to bring up we believe is a major issue with the development code. It is our opinion right now that it is nearly impossible to maintain a family working ranch with a gross floor area of over 20,000 square feet in Santa Barbara County. Currently, the development code requires a development plan for properties over 20,000 square feet at a cost more of $15,000. This route is expensive, cumbersome, and especially since any change, however minimal, would cost an additional $15,000 to revise the development plan. This doesn't seem like a reasonable path. It was our belief that the Ag Streamlining Project was going to solve this problem by increasing the square footage threshold, but the new proposed tier levels have been drastically reduced, so they offer no help to 37% of the Ag 2 property owners and little help for the rest. Please return the square footage threshold to the original proposed values and consider implementing an exemption for basic agricultural structures. We prefer that the development code help keep ag lands within families that care for the land. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Deanna Durner. Also remote, I believe.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. My name is Brianna Durner. Thank you for your time. The recent decrease in the proposed square footage threshold allowances has many ranch families concerned. An increase in the tier levels is critical to families trying to keep their ranches operational as well as within the family. Increasing the square footage threshold isn't about taking away agricultural lands. It's about growing them. It's about keeping agriculture viable, local, within families, and within our community. We respectfully ask you to increase the proposed tier levels to reflect the original proposal. Thank you for your time and effort in improving the current process for agricultural properties.
And thank you for your comments. Susan Petrovich?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the commission. My name is Susan Petrovich with the law firm of Brownstein Hyatt Farber Schreck. I'm here representing quite a few people. Unfortunately, as many of you know, I'm on the Santa Barbara Cattlemen's Association Land Use Committee, and unfortunately today is the association's annual meeting. So many of their members who are concerned about this issue cannot attend. And one of my requests is that you hold a second hearing so that on a date when they can attend. Also, I represent Rancho Encantado, which is a walnut and cattle operation in Santa Ynez Valley, and I believe Mr. Henn has submitted his letter to you. I represent El Ensenal LLC, the King family, as you know, who are struggling now through litigation over their hay barn, a barn that would be able to have a zoning clearance if this ordinance package is adopted. You may recall it has no electricity, no plumbing, only 2 walls. And I have heard from many ranchers around the county who have hay barns that they didn't even know the barns required permits if they had no plumbing or electricity. And very few hay barns around the county, particularly Ag 2 lands, have permits, probably for this very reason. So I believe having a zoning clearance for the hay barns is a great way to encourage compliance. Because people are not looking at the kind of long process that the Kings have encountered. And I guess I'm also speaking on behalf of the many members of our community who enjoy seeing the entrance gates to ranches with their tall posts and cross members bearing the ranch name, or maybe no name at all, the address, and charming decorations that reflect a long-standing tradition throughout the West and certainly throughout the rural areas of our county. Did you receive my letter submitted last week? Great, okay. This ordinance package is a great idea. I would suggest a few changes. The graduated thresholds for development plans based on parcel size are a good approach, but we suggest that you return to the thresholds originally proposed. Originally, the AAC supported the higher threshold for a very good reason. It reduces development plan requirements. Just a short time ago, Paul McEnroe, who you may know, the owner of Rancho La Purísima, his house burned down, and when he went to apply to have it rebuilt, he found that he was running afoul of the development plan threshold because of the hay barns, the horse shelters. It was primarily the horse shelters, and it's not just the ones the Durners showed you, because many people have 1 or 2 walls on their shelters because the wind-driven rain will come right in, as will the wind, so you need a windbreak. And in many of our ranch lands, that wind-driven factor is a big deal. And that goes for the hay barns too. You have to have a wall or 2 walls even. So I would suggest that you either increase the threshold, or if it isn't possible, that you delete from the square footage count any buildings that have 2 or fewer walls. This prevents them from ever being used for habitation, but meets the requirements of those with livestock, shelters, and open hay barns. We really don't want to discourage ranchers from clustering their buildings where it makes them more efficient to use and less open to theft. I also suggest that for non-ag structures, you not agree to adopt a 10,000 square foot threshold. If 20,000 is okay in all the urban areas on much smaller parcels, then why wouldn't it be okay in our ag land? That just doesn't make sense. This would actually make it more restrictive in agricultural land than in every other part of the county. I also want to raise a question about the loading ramps. If there were no comments on the ND about loading ramps, why in the world are we telling people how to design their loading ramps? They're not going to build a more loading ramp than they need. They're not going to build a loading ramp that isn't suitable to their needs. So I suggest that this width and height limit be eliminated. And then I want to address finally the ranch entrances. The ranch entrance exemption is great, but the limitations create a big problem because there's so many existing entrances out there that don't meet these limitations. And I have a little short slideshow here. First of all, before I start, I do want to suggest that you delete the subparagraph that imposes the 2 foot limit on the footprint, the 2 foot in any direction of any support post, so people can combine what is now an exempt pilaster. There's no limit on the size of pilasters up to 10 feet in height with this exempt support post, so they don't have to build a separate support post. The proposed limitation makes no sense because under your existing land use development code, people in any zone, both inside and outside the coastal zone, can have these gate pilasters that are completely exempt from permitting, up to 10 feet in height if outside the setback, 8 feet in height if inside the front yard setback, with no limitation whatsoever on that footprint. Also suggest that you delete the requirement that the entrance be at the primary access. Many ranches have these gates on more than one entrance, and you'll see some photos on this slideshow, which is very quick. And then finally, allow the cross member to be 3 feet in width and depth. The ordinance says height, but I think they really mean width. So people can use more substantial and even round crossbars. And finally, I did want to respond to the question about the gate maybe being over an easement that serves more than one property. An easement, and there are certainly many ranches that take access through other people's land, but the landowner still owns that land and gets to decide on the gate style today. Unless the easement provides otherwise specifically. An easement is a limited right to a special or a specified use of another's property, not the right to tell the property owner what to do with his or her own property. So if I could just quickly run through this for you, I do want to conclude by saying that these are wonderful gates, many of which don't meet the standards that are in this ordinance. And I think our lives would be a bit less enriched if people had to remove what I believe are fabulous and harmless additions to the aesthetic experience as we drive by these entrances. For the wealthier members of the community, and this certainly doesn't include most ranchers, permits are possible, but what if someone appeals? Defending against an appeal can be horrendously expensive, especially if the reason for the appeal is a neighbor dispute that has nothing to do with the appeal. At some point, the cost of having a lovely entrance is outweighed by practical and financial considerations, and the entrance will just go away to stop the financial pain. So I would conclude by asking you to schedule a second hearing, and then if I could quickly run through this. As you can see, look down below at the base. If you take the support post and the adjacent pilaster, if you will, that's attached to it, that's going to be more than 2 feet right there. Now, that's a beautiful entrance, harmless. Now, requiring 2 feet, I don't think that would meet the 2 feet if you count the ornaments, but the ornaments are a great addition to the cross member. If you would go to the next one, Noel. And incidentally, these are all visible from a public road. This is another pilaster that's much bigger. This is the Santa Barbara Ranch right on 246, used to be the T-Bill Ranch. Those pilasters have been there for a very long time, but they wouldn't meet your specifications of a 2-foot footprint. If you'd go to the next one. This is another one that's got a hanging sign. Well, if you count the cross member and the hanging sign, they don't meet the limitation of 2 feet. And we haven't addressed the wheels and the other ornaments. I don't know how the staff would address those, but I think those are an important part of the ambiance of the entrance. If you go to the next one. Here's another one that has, and sorry for the lighting, but it was raining that day. Again, the pilasters at the base, they're not anything obtrusive, but they're more than 2 feet in any direction. They're more than 4 square feet. Next one, and they've got the hanging sign. Now this one, I agree, something like this, now this is historic, predate zoning, I'm not criticizing, it's just that I agree that this one would be over the top. But that's much more than 3 feet in width and depth on the crossbar, so that one would not qualify for the exemption, as I'm suggesting it be altered. The next one? This is another one, because of the decorations at the top, that crossbar wouldn't qualify. Next one. And instantly, that last one was at a rear entrance. This is one that they can't qualify. This is Flag is Up Farms. Their pilasters are certainly much bigger than 2 feet. And they've got an arbor across the top, so the cross members maybe, I don't know, if you take it cumulatively, I don't know whether they qualify or not. Next one. This one has pilasters. Again, it's hard to see, but certainly it's more than 2 feet of cross members if you take the total total from top to bottom, and their pilasters certainly are more than 4 square feet. Next one. This has been around forever. You probably all noticed that one. But again, if you take the pilaster, the wooden post that is combined with the support post, it doesn't qualify. Next one. This is just too dark on mine, but I hope you can see it on the photos. Again, the both at the top, and I believe that one had pilasters that were bigger as well. Next one. This is a really cute one, but again, if you take, this is an example of a round cross member. If you get a substantial cross member, you're not going to meet that 6 inches of depth. And with the decorations, again, I don't know how the staff's going to treat the decorations, but that's certainly more than the specifications. Next one. This is another example of a big substantial cross member, and you can see those hooks that used to have a sign hanging from it. So that one wouldn't meet the specifications. Next one. This is a really neat old one. It doesn't meet the specifications as far as the cross member, and it also is a back entrance to this ranch. Next, and you'll see many ranches that have the back entrances with these nice old gates. Next one. Again, the decorations, a nice solid-looking gate, but it doesn't meet your specifications under the ordinance as proposed. Next one. Same thing, pilasters won't meet the specifications, neither will a cross member. Next one. I'm not sure, again, I don't think this one would because of the hanging sign with their name on it. Next one. This is a beautiful entrance, but again, it doesn't meet the ordinance specifications. Next one. This one has both is very old, but it doesn't meet either the pilaster footprint or the sign requirements at the top. And the next one, this is the last, oh, that was the last one. Okay, I'm sorry if I went over time, but I thought you'd find those pictures interesting. Thank you.
Thank you
does
very
anyone
much.
have any questions?
Commissioner Cooney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just a little concerned about one comment you made that might lead the public to conclude that these existing gates would have to come down if we recommend to the board that they adopt this plan or something like it. You didn't mean to imply that.
No, what I was saying, what I was saying is it's a financial push with many ranches. If they have to apply for a permit, and if someone appeals that permit, or even if just the cost of the permitting is just too much for them, then they're going to have to take those down, because otherwise they're going to be subject to an enforcement action.
But some of these may be already permitted.
Yes, I didn't do a permit search.
Okay.
I don't know which ones are and are not.
Yeah, and as Ms. Black indicated, many may predate the regulation that would require a permit in the first place. So I don't want the public to have the impression that all of these gates are going to be subject to this new regulation, but future gates would be. And so that we understand to be a legitimate basis for our discussion today, and appreciate everything you've had to say.
Well, if I could respond to that, actually, I have a client who has a very simple gate, and there's a zoning enforcement action against him right now. Simpler than anything you saw there. And the county is pursuing, because a neighbor doesn't like it. And it has nothing to do with the gate, of course, it has to do with other issues. But all a neighbor has to do is drop the dime on you, and if you don't have a permit today, then you're subject to zoning enforcement right now. So yes, I am telling you that people do have something to worry about. A, if you don't adopt an ordinance that makes them exempt, and B, if the ordinance is not inclusive enough, and that's why I had all these pictures taken at some substantial effort, so you could see the kinds of gates that wouldn't fall within this exemption, so you can consider that in your deliberations and your recommendation to the board. Because I'm sure we want to see these gates stay. That's all I'm suggesting. So I wanted you to see the variety that we've got. And yes, some of them are historic and predate zoning, but not most of them. Most of them that you saw there would be subject to the current ordinance that the staff takes the position would not allow those gates to stand unless this ordinance is adopted, and adopted in a way that the gates would meet the specifications.
Ms. Black, you have a comment?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I just want to make it really clear. We are not saying these gates can't stay.
Remain.
If they weren't legally permitted through a land use permit and these ordinance provisions are not adopted, they would require a land use permit. But we're not saying that they have to be removed.
No.
So what we're really talking about, and
It's
I'm
future.
happy to hear the commission's comments about the particular provisions that we've come up with, and maybe there are some reasonable adjustments that should be made, but we're trying to identify a class of gates that could be exempt from permit requirements entirely. Right now, all gates in the setback require a permit.
All right.
And
this
that's
type.
very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. Ken Cars?
Well, good morning. My name is Ken Karras. We own 103 acres zoned Ag 2 just south of San Ynez River, which we're developing into a vineyard. My comments today will be directed to the structure thresholds that would trigger a development plan. I applaud the intent of the streamlining proposal and the efforts of all involved. However, while I believe what the staff originally proposed in May would have been positive and effective with regard to the thresholds, I believe the December proposal fails with regard to what I believe was the primary mission of this whole endeavor, which is to reduce the number of cumbersome and expensive development plans for ag properties. Worse yet, I believe it imposes new rules that will result in even more development plans. One of the things I did is I back-tested the May and December proposals against each development plan filed in the last 10 years. And the May plan would have resulted in the elimination of 70% of the development plans, which is a good outcome. However, in contrast, the December proposal results in the elimination of not one development plan. So of every development plan filed in the last 10 years, this new proposal would not eliminate one. It has no effect. It's, sort of meaningless. And I really think that's kind of astonishing. There are two reasons the December proposal fails to eliminate even one development plan when back-tested. First, the overall square footage thresholds were cut dramatically from what they were in May. They were cut by 65 to 77% from what was proposed in May. And without pretty much any explanation. There was no explanation in the draft. Ms. Paley, provided some explanation today, although there wasn't anything in the draft ND. Second, and as we've heard about today, staff proposed a completely new limitation on the use of ag property related to what is called non-ag structures, something for which I don't believe there actually is a definition other than it's something that's not an ag structure. It is on this item, the 10,000 square foot non-ag structure threshold, that I'd like to focus the remainder of my comments. First, this 10,000 square foot limitation will actually result in more development plans being filed, not fewer. When back tested against the development plans filed in the last 10 years, fully 55% of them would still require a development plan due to this provision. And most importantly, staff did not do an analysis to determine how many other projects would have been affected going back over the last 10 years. There are many projects that undoubtedly had non-ag structures in excess of 10,000 square feet that just didn't get picked up. So I don't think there's any question that if adopted the way it is, that, you know, A, it's not going to reduce any development plans, it's actually going to clearly increase them. You know, second, and Susan sort of mentioned this too, you know, there's no such 10,000 square foot threshold that triggers a development plan anywhere else in the county. And, you know, why should ag property owners be singled out for this? I guess a third point would believe, I don't believe that the 5,000 owners of 650,000 acres, which I believe represents 75% of the privately held property in this county, were informed of a significant new ordinance that is going to impact their property. People I've talked to, I mean, virtually no one knows about this. And when they find out about the 10,000 square foot limitation, no one seems terribly happy about it. So my request is that the Planning Commission defer a decision on this until one, you know, all Ag 1 and Ag 2 property owners in the county are informed of this process, which again represents a huge amount of the private property in the county. Staff provides an analysis to support the premise that the new thresholds will meaningfully reduce the need for development plans, which was really sort of the whole point. And finally, it would be my request that the 10,000 square foot restriction just be scrapped. It has nothing to do with streamlining anything. And I think it's inappropriate that it be included in something whose, you know, purpose is to provide streamlining. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andy Caldwell?
Chairman Valencia, members of the commission, I'm Andy Caldwell representing CoLab. I don't know if you know this, but for the last 7 years I've served on the Process Improvement Committee. And for 2 of those years we worked on this plan. And I also go to virtually all of the AAC meetings. I'm not a member of it, but I do participate extensively. This was the first major pit project to benefit agriculture, which is the major acreage throughout this county. And after 2 years of negotiations and discussions and the project going back and forth between the pit and the AAC and even the Planning Commission, we arrived at thresholds that were meaningful. And we got sabotaged. There was a late hit. Staff ran this by people that don't go to the AAC and don't participate in the pit, and they in essence exercise some sort of de facto veto power. And that wasn't fair to the process and to the people that show up month after month, year after year. And this is in your staff report. The last speaker actually did this math. I was hoping your staff was going to have this in here. This is in a little of appendix to his submission. And here's what we're talking about. At this threshold here, we're talking about for the larger ranches, anywhere from 5 feet to 156 feet of development per acre. Okay. You know, it's a closet. It's the size of a closet. We have to quit thinking urban and what does this mean in an urban area and start putting this into perspective of a 1,000 or 10,000 acre ranch. And that's what you've lowered it to. You've lowered it to, at the high end, 5 feet per acre is what they can have. And here's what it should have been. It should have been a grand total of 10. We think most people could have lived with 10 square feet per acre development for something that doesn't have water or electricity running to it. This isn't some subterfuge for development. This is what the ag community, the AAC, which the majority of those people are appointed by the board, came up with. We ask you, this is a realistic, reasonable standard. The other issues is lighting. Lighting for a gate is a public safety issue, i.e. can the fire department find them? It's a public safety issue. Does a trucker run into the gate because there's no lights out there? And it's also a security issue. You know that people will access, they'll take a road if it's open, and a substantial gate can be a deterrent to trespassing. The loading ramps, that one came out of left field. Why somebody would want to restrict these guys on that is beyond me. We completely support the Cattleman letter, and I also agree with the last speaker that this introducing a new threshold in the name of streamlining, it doesn't belong on this non-ag development. And here's the last point. During that 2 years at Pitt, we came up with these numbers because we believe these numbers and these types of projects hadn't been subjects of appeals. We were looking for low-hanging fruit, i.e. what should the ag community be able to do that isn't going to raise any ire in the community? Because over the last number of years, Pat had researched all of these projects and didn't find appeals on them. This was low-hanging fruit. This is supposed to be no-brainer streamlining that isn't going to cause any problems because it hasn't in the last 10 years. So we'd ask you to go back to it. Thank you.
Paul Van Leer.
Good morning. My name is Paul Van Leer. I too am an AAC member, but I'm speaking on behalf of myself this morning. I want to start off with thanking the staff and the Planning Commission for doing a really good job. And it's been a big struggle and coming to us on the AAC numerous times for our recommendations. We appreciate that. Just a couple questions I have. As far as the livestock loading ramps, I too don't know where that came from. I don't really know if that's an issue. I can't imagine why. We would not build a ramp that we didn't need for ag uses. We would not make them any taller or wider than necessary. I don't understand where that came from. I'd like to strike that from this document if possible. Also, just a clarification in your staff report under environmental review, where it says adding a new DP threshold of 10,000 square feet. Shouldn't that say for non-ag building area? It says non-residential. I mean, it's a little, because we're always talking about non-ag building and ag too. Just like a clarification of that. Also, the development thresholds. It's been kicked around a lot, and obviously we would have liked to have it larger. I agree that if we can exclude hay barns or horse sheds, and if two or fewer walls will work, well, that would be something, because it's not ever going to be something where somebody can live in. There's no power, electricity. Maybe they could exclude that from that 50,000 square foot threshold, and that might make it easier for everybody. Also, to conclude, I would ask that you please do not encumber these policy changes with restrictions or requirements, because I feel this would defeat the purpose of helping ag. Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
On a pole barn, you see these huge pole barns, and you see the hay in there, and they're open, and when it rains, the water comes in and hits that hay. Doesn't that rot the hay when it starts getting that
Typically,
moisture?
it has to be blown from sideways. I mean,
Yeah.
typically you'll have like a little, you'll notice some of them have like a short distance down,
Yeah,
maybe not
some
all the
do,
way.
yeah.
And that does make it, yeah, they will get a little wet, but that's why I say the two sides. You can go to the additional expense to do two sides on the windward side, so it would
I would think
keep
that,
that
and I see
happening.
some that don't have that, and I wonder, my gosh, the hay on the bottom.
Well, it's an expense. It's an additional expense for
loss,
people
it's
to.
a loss, yeah.
It costs money to do that, so I
Yeah.
mean, that would be an expense that they might want to do. But there again, two sides are just the top.
A necessity.
It's a necessity, for sure.
Thank you very much. All right, and our last speaker is Christina McGinnis in Santa Barbara. Ms. McGinnis, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Get close to the microphone, please.
Okay. Good morning, Chair Valencia and Commissioners. My name is Christina McGinnis with the Open Project, and wanted to say that we are concerned about the long-term viability of farming operations throughout the county, and do support the proposed changes with this land use development code ordinance, as long as the environmental impacts that would result from these proposed changes are properly addressed. And primarily the concern is with the allowance for individual structures of 20,000 square feet in size to be built without any discretionary environmental review. So we would suggest that the threshold for those structures be reduced to somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 square feet. This is a county-wide ordinance that would, a 20,000 square foot structure is a large structure, and the potential for environmental impact not only to convert prime ag land out of ag use, visual impacts and potential biological resource impacts is great. I also suggested in my letter some ordinance that could be added to the language to further define what would qualify as an ag support structure, and that was adopted based on some of the uniform rules from the Williamson Act. One thing I also believe should be included in the ordinance language would be to address ESHA setbacks, that they should be explicitly stated for the development plan threshold increases, to require at least a minimum 100-foot setback, which is pretty standard in the rural areas of the county, and that both habitat that actually is designated as ESHA and habitat that would qualify as ESHA should be considered for that particular setback. For visual corridors, the standard that's set forth in the ordinance language to have 1,000 feet on either side of the center line of the road could be further defined with development standards that require a look at topography and view sheds. And also I have included some design standard suggestions to require that night lighting is not visible from public roadways, that the design of ag support structures should be consistent with the rural character of the area, that infrastructure needed to support these structures should be minimized to the maximum extent feasible, and that height of these structures should be limited to avoid impacts to visual resources, and that they should be limited to only that needed to support the proposed use. Just because of the county-wide implications, potential and build out with this increase up to 50,000 square feet, it could allow for 2 individual 20,000 square foot structures to be built without any discretionary review, and that is of concern. And finally, I would ask for 1 additional minute because the Valley Alliance did not receive the notice that this hearing time had been moved. They were planning on going to the time certain of 1 o'clock and didn't receive the email from Ms. Saley about this morning. So may I have another minute to relay their concerns?
Please proceed.
Thank you. The Valley Alliance was concerned about the total amount of square footage. They believe that the 50,000 square foot threshold should apply only to the very large ag parcels, and that a lower threshold should be applied to some of the smaller ag 40 and so on parcels, and that those should be 25,000 to 35,000 square feet and not receive the 50,000 square feet. That was the one comment they requested that I pass on for them. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. I just, excuse me for a second, Ms. Blank. I was just wondering, you know, on 100 acres, how many square footage are there in 100 acres? 4,350,000 square feet. And we're talking about 50,000 square feet.
4356.
Okay, thank you. That is just an enormous amount of square footage. That 50,000 is just very small. Yes, Ms. Black, you had something.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to clarify the last comment Ms. McGinnis made on behalf of Valley Alliance. If you look at Table 3 on page 10 of your staff report, it really, the current proposal is for parcels 320 acres in size or greater would have that 50,000 square foot threshold. So I think we actually have revised the proposal to address the concerns of the Valley Alliance.
When you get to these numbers, you're talking about less than 1%. You're talking about 1/4%. I mean, it's small. Yes, Commissioner Blau.
Yeah, I just have a question for staff. Can you give me a little breakdown of the dollars and the timing for the major, or the minor use permit, the land use permit, and the zoning clearance? What the difference are in those three processes? For example, I find it ridiculous to spend 15 grand for a permit for a sign or a gate entry, but so give me an idea of what the dollars and cents are here.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Blau, I didn't bring the fee schedule with me, so I'll talk in general. Development plan and conditional use permit applications are discretionary applications. They typically require a deposit, and then applicants are monthly billed based upon the actual amount of staff time, so it can vary depending on the complexity of a project. A land use permit for this sort of, like for the gates, is, I would be guessing, $500 or less, I would guess, but I don't, like I said, I don't have that right in front of me, and that is a fixed fee. There is a concern that that might be appealed, and then the applicant would incur costs, of coming to hearings and representation.
Excuse me for a second, Commissioner Blau. Was there anybody else who wanted to speak before I close the public hearing? We came back a little prematurely. Anybody else? If not, we'll close the public hearing and we'll come back to the staff. Did the staff have any comments? Any further comments? Then before we bring it back to the commission.
Mr. Chair, I think you heard a lot of comments today, and we're happy to address questions from the commission, but I think it would be a little bit repetitive to just go through and address each
Very
comment.
good.
So anything you'd like us to address, we can.
All right, we'll come back to the commissioners now to comment on Commissioner Blau.
I have more questions of staff. I'd like to get a response to the reasoning that we didn't go along with the committee. Address Mr. Caldwell's comments. He's telling me that he met with the committee and there was some consensus for it was a different number, and all of a sudden the recommendation's different. So I'd like to hear the explanation for that.
Mr. Chair, maybe I'll take a shot at that question. And Commissioner Blau, we actually prepared an ND back in May of 2009, circulated that for public review, and received substantial comments on that document, which led us to believe that either we needed to reduce the proposal or prepare an EIR. We were certainly not in a position where we could prepare an EIR. This project is not funded very well, to say the least, and it just wasn't something that we could do. So we worked with the commenters as well as the AAC to try and come up with some compromises that would address the environmental concerns relating to the proposal, and it led to what you see before you today. So it was really to address those comments and environmental issues.
And maybe we had one other speaker that commented on the back testing of this process, and that we're not really doing anybody any favors by going through this process. Did we back test it or verify that, or?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Blau, one of the attachments, I think it's attachment 5, if I remember correctly, to the negative declaration, goes through the last 10 years of development plans that were submitted that triggered the 20,000 square foot threshold. So if they were a winery or something, they were getting a development plan for a different reason. There were 10, as I recall, and I'd like to compare notes with Mr. Karras, but we put in that exhibit what the total square footage would be, the total non-agricultural square footage, and by my accounting, 2 of 10 of them would not have required development plans under the current proposal with 50,000 square feet max, all buildings, 10,000 for non-ag. So 20% would have avoided the development plan requirement. If memory serves, and this is just based on my memory, the May numbers that were roughly twice, it was more the opposite. Almost all of them would not have required development plans, and that was some of what the public reacted to when we did our first initial study back in a negative declaration back in May, and we had to relook at those numbers. And that's when we gathered more information about what is actually on the ground for the typical cattle operation, the typical row crop operation. And we found that what's on the ground is more in the 20, 30, 40,000 square feet, even on some of these 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 acre properties. So that's some of why we dropped that threshold, because we thought it still met a need. And one of the challenges for all of us is who knows what the unmet demand is out there. And that's the speculation. So we're trying to make a difference, not go for the lowest common denominator. We're trying for the highest, to make a difference without sacrificing the environment, which is what the environmental review process is about. And, you know, we'd rather take a little smaller step, see how it goes, test it for a year or two, and then maybe consider going farther if we find it hasn't made as much of a difference as we thought.
Mr. Chair, if I could continue?
Please.
And I'd also like to know how we arrived at the 10,000 square feet for non-ag related buildings.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Blau, that was admittedly somewhat arbitrary, but when you look at what constitutes square footage, it's porches, it can be basements, depending on the design. We felt that was a pretty substantial primary home and seemed appropriate. And always when we're doing this stuff, we try to seize on something that already is on the books. We're trying not to add more things. And there wasn't anything easy to rely on. So we just talked about what is...
So what's on the books now? I didn't know there was a limitation.
No, there isn't. That's the point.
So this is brand new?
This is brand new, yes.
Okay, and there's nothing else like it in any place else in the county, am I correct?
Not to my knowledge,
Okay.
no. That's correct.
Ms. Brooks, Commissioner Brooks.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Valencia. I know in my discussion yesterday with Ms. Saley, you know, I had several concerns based on the letters that I had received, and I had to go back to make sure that I'm comfortable, you know, today, you know, and with what I hope will be the focus of today's discussion. The original intent of the ordinance amendments is to simplify for small projects to support ag viability. Some of the letters, some of the comments today make me think, you know, this is maybe beyond the scope of what we're to look at today. And I'm hoping that, you know, as we have our deliberations, I had gotten an explanation about, you know, the neg deck versus, let's say, a full EIR. And I am comfortable, you know, discussing what we have in front of us today, knowing that if we get into, you know, discussions of larger projects, you know, more controversial projects, you know, we might be just pushing this into a whole other area. And I don't think that's the purpose for today. So that's just an observation I made based on my discussion yesterday.
Thank you. I have a question, Commissioner, before you speak, Commissioner Cooney, is that all right? What would be a trigger that would trigger an EIR on the amount of square footage that we increased? For instance, if we increased everything 10,000 square feet, would that trigger an EIR, or would that still be safe as?
Mr. Chair, and members of the commission, I wish I could answer that and give you a bright line number. I don't think there is a bright line between what we think we can justify analysis under an ND versus an EIR. So it's really a matter for your discretion.
All right. Commissioner Cooney, do you have some questions?
Well, Mr. Chair, just regarding the process, I think this is a lot for us to absorb. I read the staff report twice and still had a number of issues that were roiling around in my mind. It's not helped by the discussion today, because what I see is a direct clash between two important constituencies in our county. One, the agricultural interests who, and I have to disagree with Mr. Karras on this, have been not only well informed about this process, but have been a part of it for the last year. And maybe there are people that didn't get the word that the enterprise was underway, but I don't think there's any lack of input from the agricultural community, and we've certainly heard about it and read about it in numerous letters. And we understand, I think, that that what is proposed today does not satisfy the ag community entirely, and certainly there are very constructive suggestions for how to improve it. But on the other hand, to suggest, as Mr. Caldwell did, that the staff went to the environmental community and got their input on the sly is really a misrepresentation of the process as I've seen it develop. Maybe the Ag Advisory Committee and the Valley Alliance were not in the room at the same time. I don't know. But certainly when you do environmental review of anything, even to simplify, everyone is entitled to make their comments. And I feel we've received those comments, and staff has, in its effort to steer a line between these conflicting interests, come up with some recommendations. Are they all exactly as each of us might like them? I don't think so, but I think it's a very good effort, and it gives us a discussion starting point. I would comment that we heard requests from more than one speaker today to have a second hearing. I don't object to that. I feel like, well, one thing we could do is just send what we come to a conclusion on here onto the Board of Supervisors and let them do it. Or we could be open to a second hearing at some point on our light schedule and be sure we've caught all the comments that people want to make. You know, I don't think I have to move to the substance at this point unless the commission feels we need to dispose of all of this today.
Thank you very much. And I have another
Go ahead, Joe.
You know, I'd like to make a little disclaimer. I've been on the Planning Commission here for years, like many of the members here, and we deal with hundreds of projects. So it's difficult for us to be experts on a staff report when it comes in, but we do the best we can for the week or two that we get the report. We read it over, mark it up, read it over, go on site visits. But here's this group, this PIT group, who's been working on this thing for a year or 2 years, whatever it's been. The Cattlemen's Association, the other advisory group. I mean, they've all worked at this much more than we have. And so I think I have to agree that we need to continue this item until we have a full commission and we have a chance to read this a little further. What brought me to that comment was that when I read the San Lucas Ranch letter from Ms. Crawford Hall, she makes 9 points, and they all kind of make sense to me. And I wondered, well, the staff isn't going to do something just to go against agriculture. They're trying to correct something and bring it up to speed and make some things easier. But her letter also makes sense. So I think maybe we need further discussion on this, and full commission would be good on this. Commissioner Blau.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you. I do think we need to continue this, especially since we didn't have the cattlemen people able to hear today, and I'm not sure how widely publicized this particular meeting is. Having said that, there's a couple of things that I could actually make comment on now so that the staff could come back maybe and address those issues. I would like to see, give me a nice little chart that talks about how much money we're potentially saving by using this program. I think we can come up with some good examples or some history to talk about it. I will tell you, having damn near crashed my motorhome in a damn ditch, and going through a gate that wasn't lighted, I'm in favor of lighting the gates. It was only a $900 bill to get the tow truck to move it to 4 feet. But I do see that being a problem. And I know I think we spent some money last meeting to do some lighting for the county, and I'm sure they can come up with some standards that would be appropriate. That, you know, we don't want to light the sky up, but we definitely want to light the ground up and light the posts up, and so I think that's appropriate. I mean, the 10,000 square foot limitation for non-ag, I don't know where that came from, but I don't want any part of it for me. I mean, if it's not in any other parcel or zoning in the county, I don't know why we would pick out this one to do it. I can't believe farmers are going to build anything or that's not going to make sense to their farming operation, and I don't think we need to restrict them. The only other thing I saw, to tell you the truth, was that's going to cause me some concern is this whole idea of policing the farm workers. You know, for me, it would be good enough that the farmer signed a certification once a year under penalty of perjury that the property is being used for farm workers. I don't see the reason to get a new police Gestapo to go out there and start patrolling it for them. I just don't think that's necessary. I don't want to be part of that kind of government, to tell you the truth. Those are my comments, but I agree that I think we do need to continue because there's a few things I want to come back and see, and a few people I want to talk to. And you're right, we have plenty of time in the schedule.
Thank you, Commissioner Blau. Commissioner Brooks.
Yes, thank you. I think I'm probably more prepared today myself, just personally, to start looking more closely at some of these items. I have, 4 pages of typed notes here. I looked at each of the items and, I had some questions. I do have some concerns. I'm certainly in agreement, with much of, what we have in our staff report and in our documentation today. Again, I look back at the purpose of today and of the amendments, and these are supposed to be fairly non-controversial. I think Pitt, when they've been looking at these things very closely, for 2 years, I think easily we could talk at least about the gates and the ramps today. I mean, I would like to talk about each of them today, at least to get started on the process. So, knowing, okay, we might not come to a vote, but I think I'd like to get as much done today as possible. And then I know there might be some new language that will come out of the discussions, but yes, looking ahead that maybe the final decisions would not be made today. We can look at another meeting, but we really need to get the issues out here. And again, it's supposed to be fairly non-controversial for some of these, and that's why these particular items were chosen. So I'd like to have plenty of discussion if we could.
Well, my feeling is that all these cattlemen association and the other groups would have a chance to be here and possibly give us additional input, which we don't have, concerning the ramps, something about the lighting, something about the additional buildings. I think it's very important to listen to that before. We could have discussion here, but then we're going to have that discussion again. When I drive on 246 out by Mall Road, there's a new area that started getting farming at high-end farming in that area. And there's a lot of equipment that's left out, and I often wonder, why is it left out? Because they can't build buildings, and all the equipment is out there and just for the weather to weatherize it and destroy it, and I wonder, why do these people leave that out? Well, they can't build buildings. They built one little building and they quickly pushed as much hay as they could in that. It's either hay or leave the tractor out, and the tractor can probably handle the weather and the rain a little better than the hay, but the hay, you get water in it and pretty soon it's going to rot. And so the investments by these people is great, and they're all trying to get by with as little as possible. Some occasionally put up a little cover, but pretty soon the county or somebody talks about it and they get caught and they're in trouble. So I think we need to have an input by all these groups here, and it would be one meeting dedicated just to that, starting at 9 in the morning and as long as it takes. And I think we would hear all what the farmers have to say, both groups, have them both here, and we'd be able to make a better decision. And with that, Commissioner Blau, you have another comment.
Yeah, I don't disagree. Mr. Chair, I was going to respond to Commissioner Brooks's response. I forgot the loading ramp. I see no reason for that to be in there at all. That makes no sense to me that I'm convinced farmers not going to build anything or do anything that's not appropriate for their cattle and their operation. Why would they? And so, just to respond to Commissioner Brooks' comment.
Commissioner Brooks first, and then Commissioner Cooney.
Okay, probably staff. I'm hearing, from some of my fellow commissioners that, that we haven't had the adequate time for public input. I think we follow the process, and I like to think sometimes when my phone isn't ringing off the hook that, well, gee, everybody has read it, and maybe a lot of the issues have been solved, and that we are ready to have more public input today, start our deliberations, get more clarification if needed. But staff, I think the process has been followed, and maybe you can provide more insight into that. Do we need to wait for another meeting, or is it time to start?
Well, that's a hard decision. Commissioner Cooney.
Well, I certainly agree with Commissioner Brooks that we could start asking some of the questions that each of us has developed with respect to how we got to a particular recommendation by staff. So we could determine, for example, how the issue of the ramps came up. I mean, I can imagine a ramp that would require a permit, but all the ramps that I've seen on ranches wouldn't or shouldn't, and they're as much a part of the ranch as the grass is. And so I think part of the problem is we put some easy targets up there to shoot at, and the whole process gets attacked because of something like trying to regulate cattle ramps. There is no one size that fits all, but the bigger ones are, I think they're as much a part of the ranching landscape as anything else. I was getting in a mood to quarrel at length with over the issue of the gates and what they look like, because we weren't saying anybody couldn't have any gate they want. It's just a question of does staff get a chance to look at it and apply some standards, or should we just say if it's a gate, it's a gate, it gets to be built? These are all things that would merit a lot of discussion. We can certainly do that today, but I'm sympathetic to the comments that an important part of this constituency would like to be here in person and offer testimony. Ms. McGinnis suggested that the Valley Alliance had not gotten the notice despite the efforts of staff to be here, and I'd like to hear from the Valley Alliance directly. The one issue that she advanced is certainly important. Maybe that's all they have to say. Maybe they're happy with the rest, but if the commission is going to add development standards, for example, I think they should have input on that. And finally, and most importantly, I think Commissioner Brown is absent today through no fault of her own, and her input would certainly be valuable to me. So we can pose different suggestions to staff of additional work that we'd like to see, but I'm in favor of allowing the greatest possible public input before we deliberate.
Sounds good. And with that, maybe Commissioner Black, new job.
I don't want that job.
Ms. Black?
Mr. Chair, if I could make a suggestion. First of all, I think if we have an additional hearing, that's certainly appropriate. I regret that Commissioner Brown wasn't able to attend today, and I think she has a lot of insight on some of these issues. I would recommend we continue this for 2 weeks to our March 3rd agenda. I don't think this will take all day. I think we can provide some additional information and analysis in the meantime. We'll certainly provide the chart on the potential savings from these measures that Commissioner Blau requested. We will look at the ramp issue and see if there's a way for us to just exempt ramps. If we're silent, they are a structure and they would require a permit. So we need to address it in some way. We'll relook at the gate standards in the context of the slides that Ms. Petrovich showed. I think those were fairly compelling, and I think it's pretty easy to point out what you want to include and what you don't want to include. How you describe that in an ordinance is a little bit more difficult. We'll at least provide an explanation of the 10,000 square foot non-ag exemption or a threshold for a development plan. It's up to the commission as to what you want to do with that, but we can at least describe that in a bit more detail. The one thing I think would be helpful to know from the commission is whether or not you want us to do any further work on the additional development standards that we identified as a possibility if the commission felt like those were necessary to mitigate impacts or address particular environmental concerns. And other than that, I think we can provide additional information and then allow the public additional opportunity to speak.
I think a good discussion, thank you very much for that. I think a good discussion on the thresholds proposed by the other side versus what the staff proposed, of why the difference, you know, and again, looking at what the trigger would be for an EIR when you get to those numbers. It's very difficult, I realize, you know, it's just a happy guess maybe. And then the other thing is to make sure that it isn't Happy Cattle Day or something that they can't come in, you know. Make sure that all these people can come in and discuss this thing. 2 weeks, it's not something that it's a cattleman holiday or...
Is it Happy Cattle Day on March 3rd?
Happy Pancake Day or anything like that? Yeah. You're past branding and all the milking and all that thing, okay.
And people can obviously testify from this hearing room. That hearing will be
Okay.
in Santa Barbara, but if they want to come and
Okay, it would
testify
be in
from this
Santa, you
hearing.
hear that, it would be in Santa Barbara, and, but you could testify from here remotely. And you had a question, I'll listen to that, yes.
I'm sorry about that.
Please come to the microphone, you have to come to the microphone. Identify yourself, please.
My name is Les Freeman. I got here late because I was wound up with my accountant, and so I bypassed the cattlemen's meeting today. I have gotten no notices about any of this. The only reason I know about something is one of my neighbors let me know. And so the notice really hasn't gone out. I mean, I don't know how you notice everybody in the county. I don't know how you would do that.
Okay.
But anyway, that was my
Okay,
comment.
we'll take care of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I could just clarify the notice that we did do, and the staff should correct me if I don't include everything. We have done an eighth page ad notice in papers. We've notified the members of the AAC and other agricultural groups that we're aware of. We've notified everybody who provided comments at various stages in the process. What we didn't do is we didn't attempt to mail a notice to each and every agricultural property owner in the county. That's just not, it's not required by our ordinance. It's not something that we've traditionally done.
Yeah, we can only spend so much money trying to get the
Right.
word out.
But we've certainly made
Okay.
attempts to provide individual
Okay.
notice to as many people as
Well, a motion to continue this would be, Ms. Saley, did you want to say something?
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to put on the record, we also sent notice of this to the Oversight Committee, and those agendas go to like 60, 70 people well-connected in the community.
Perhaps Mr. Caldwell could announce it on his TV show or on his radio show also. Commissioner Blau.
Yeah, I just had one more issue I think I'd like to see. You know, I read this a week ago, so it's, I don't remember to look this up, but I'm concerned about the definition of structures, and especially when it comes to things like, you know, I'm not sure I would see this one picture in here where the horse is on a little shade thing to necessarily be a structure, and I think there's some confusion as to who that qualifies. So I think we'd need to have the staff come back with something that's very, very clear what's a structure, what's not a structure, so we don't have issues in the future.
And since there's only a couple of letters in there, maybe we can give a response to some of those letters. Like in the past, some of our reports say, here's letter so-and-so, and here's a response to those comments. Some of the comments, that's not the only letter. I read Mrs. Petrovich's letter and the other letters in there, and maybe there could be some, you know, a quick answer to that. Commissioner Brooks.
Yes, thank you. I do agree with the definition here of the structures. I would like to, for our next hearing, that we clarify, you know, if they are temporary, I mean, then they are temporary. You know, would that have to be included? There was I think it was in the ordinance language, you know, on the last page, something about temporary filming structures and locations. And again, what is temporary? You know, is it a month, 2 weeks? That might, and if they're so temporary, then, you know, I would think that they would be excluded, you know, from that. But I think we need to define, you know, what temporary is.
All right, fine, and with that, could we have a motion to continue this item? Commissioner?
Yes,
go
I will make the motion to continue it, Mr. Chair, but I would like to respond to Ms. Black's
Certainly.
invitation to ask staff to do minimal work on development standards. I think we have lots of development standards in other areas of the code, and for example, lighting, I don't have any problem at all lighting gates as long as it's appropriate lighting. That's a county-wide problem. That's not just an ag issue. And so I think to have some guidance from pulling different parts of the county land use ordinances together, so we have that in front of us, would be very helpful. And so my motion is to continue this hearing to the Planning Commission hearing of March 3rd in Santa Barbara.
I'll second it.
All right, thank you. Any further discussion? Ms. Rodriguez would,
Yeah,
yes.
I'm sorry, Commissioner. Staff asked us to go through some of the other issues. Ms. Black, did we do that, or do you want to put that slide up
already
there and
did
talk
that.
about it? You've already done that? Okay, fine. Then I'm good to go on
All
the
right.
motion, Joe.
Ms. Rodriguez, could you call the roll, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Brooks?
Yes.
Commissioner Cooney?
Aye.
Commissioner Blau?
Aye.
Commissioner
Oh,
Burnett?
I'm sorry.
That's all right, Joe.
You're not used to being last.
It's true.
Commissioner Blau?
And aye.
Commissioner Valencia?
Aye.
Motion
Sorry.
passes 4-0.
Okay, thank you very much for coming to the meeting. Meeting is adjourned.